Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Laddie Montag Junior Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an opportunity to glean insights from top leaders in their respective fields. In each episode, we invite these leaders to share their insights, reflect on their journeys, and talk about the skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Simon Chesterman, the David Marshall Professor and Vice-Provost for Educational Innovation at the National University of Singapore. He is also founding Dean of NUS College. He serves as Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore and editor of the Asian Journal of International Law. Previously, he was Dean of NUS Law for 10 years, and he was co-president of the Law School's Global League. He was educated in Melbourne, Beijing, Amsterdam, and Oxford, and has taught at the universities of Melbourne, Oxford, Southampton, Columbia, and Sciences Po. He was the global professor and director of the New York University School of Law's Singapore program. Before joining NYU, he was at the International Peace Academy and Director of UN Relations at the International Crisis Group in New York. He has also worked for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Yugoslavia and interned at the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books, a recognized authority on international law. He also writes on legal education more generally, and is the author of 5 novels, and we'll talk about them as we go along. So
we still have time after that very generous introduction. That's very kind of you.
So I want to start with something that you probably don't get asked a whole lot these days, international affairs. And in particular, the question which came up at a forum that you attended recently, and is international affairs a jungle?
So I think the world is a complex place. And one of the things I think I benefited from early on in life was travel. I grew up in an Australia that was much more kind of parochial than it is now, but we traveled virtually and we traveled physically. We traveled virtually in that my elder brothers started learning about other cultures. So one brother studied Chinese, the other brother worked in an Indian restaurant. So we learned about those cultures. Then I had the opportunity to go and live in China for a year before starting university. And I think that was actually really eye-opening for me because in a year in Beijing back in 1991, I learned obviously a bit about China, but I learned a huge amount about Australia by not being there, by being out of my comfort zone. And so back to international affairs, I think it's absolutely a complex, dynamic environment that is in some ways more dangerous, in some ways less dangerous than in the past. More dangerous in that there are a lot more flashpoints. There's a lot more scope for things to quickly spiral out of control. Less dangerous in that we don't have the kind of nuclear tension that we used to, although some of that's coming back. But what this means for an international lawyer and an academic interested in international affairs is that it's absolutely fascinating. There's so much to study, so much work to do, and so much opportunity to try and educate a generation of students who will be able to navigate this complex, dynamic world. But to pursue the metaphor to its base, there was also a period when I was at university when the first Gulf War, 1991, when George H.W. Bush, the president of the United States at the time, sort of said, well, there's the rule of the law and the rule of law and rule of the jungle, and that international law should try and shape a world that was governed by law rather than purely by might. We haven't yet reached that point. I think there's still a lot of power politics that goes on in the world. But as a great American international lawyer, Louis Henkin, once said, it is kind of amazing that most laws, most states comply with most of international law most of the time when there's no police force to compel them. So I remain optimistic. Myself and people like Hugo Grotius, one of the founders of modern international law, that at least we're heading in the right direction, away from the jungle, maybe not towards paradise, but maybe to a better ordered jungle, maybe a nice garden, perhaps.
Thanks. And the question that came up during this event I referenced was, of course, the one involving Kishore Mahbubani. And if I recall correctly, you were the only one given the opportunity to ask a question publicly. And the question you asked was, what would be one thing that you would have wished you'd known at different points of your life that you think might have helped you? So I'm going to ask you that question, but also ask you what prompted you to ask that question.
So for me, the thing that it's a much more base sort of thing. The thing I wish I'd known, that the only piece of advice I give new parents is get more sleep. Not realizing that as joyous as the birth of a child is, that's the start of a whole journey. So rest before then would be my key piece of advice. But I'm actually, the reason I asked that of Kishore is Kishore had sort of more discrete career paths. And this is Kishore Mahbubani, the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, a former ambassador for Singapore, who represented Singapore the only time it was on the UN Security Council. And so he had these careers that were sort of marked by sharp transitions, as he was a kind of civil servant and diplomat, then he was an academic, and now he's got this sort of late life role as a public intellectual. And I think in particular, what I was interested in his journey were those transition points. I mean, in a much more modest way, I started off a career, you mentioned my bio, I started off in a think tank. I worked briefly for the UN, but pretty quickly decided that academia was where I wanted to go. And so I don't regret having spent that time in the UN and in the think tank world, but I'm pleased that I sort of worked out where I wanted to go and could build a career in academia. And so, yeah, I'm reasonably happy with what I've done. And in the sort of novelistic side of me does think about the sort of whether you would go back in time and sort of give yourself advice. And actually, I'm pretty comfortable with the choices that I made and the fact that I made them myself. And it would be somewhat disempowering to go back and say, no, you shouldn't do this, you should do that. Because I think that suggests you're living your life with a measure of regret that would suggest that you're not sort of fully invested in where you are now. So it's maybe a long way of not answering the question, but no, I'm reasonably happy with where I am now.
Let's unpack that, because I think that you have made transitions perhaps not as stark as Kishore has, but certainly in the time that you have had, and it's been quite remarkable looking at the arc of your career. You have had transitions, and one transition that you made early on was a transition into leadership. And most academics don't necessarily think about leadership. They think about thought leadership, perhaps. But you actually said, I'm going to take up this position as dean, and even before that as director of a program. But I think dean is a whole different order of things. And you were dean for 10 years. So reflect on that thought process as to what made you want to do it. Did you see what was coming when you signed up for the job? And what did you take from it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that for many academics, basically the path that I've chosen would be seen as a turn to the dark side, to university administration. But actually, maybe that sort of early period in the think tank world and the UN did kind of change me, because coming out of my doctorate, I worked in the think tank world. Basically, coming out of the doctorate, I figured there were two choices that I had to choose between. One was to go down the path of academia, and the other was UN policy work, diplomacy. And the think tank world was a happy medium. I could kind of do both. But what that meant is that from an early stage, I was always managing people and money. And this is something that academics are often trying to avoid. They're not often, well, sometimes they're not very good at it. And what it meant for me, though, was that I was never an entry-level academic. I started off kind of mid-career almost. I started off as an associate professor, having worked several years in the think tank world and at New York University as a researcher. I had some publications. And so to me, it was kind of obvious that if you're part of an institution, you should do your own work and build that sort of thought leadership and publications and do your teaching. But I've always found that there's a different kind of job satisfaction, as I know you have as well, in institution building. And so having worked at a think tank, I then set up a very small think tank, what's now the International Institute for Law and Justice, sorry, Institute for International Law and Justice, IILJ at New York University, ran the Singapore program here for NYU, and then took on a vice dean role and then dean. And I think the attraction of being dean was partly the challenge and partly the opportunity. Partly the challenge of how to take the incredible men and women working for National University of Singapore Faculty of Law and the amazing students that we have, and to try and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. But also there was a real opportunity, because having lived in Singapore then for about 5 or 6 years, this is back in 2011, 2012, if there are two things that Singapore really believes in, it's education and law. So I saw there was a real opportunity to do something more with the law school, to involve it much more directly in that sort of journey that Singapore has been following, coming historically, as the founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew put it, from third world to first, but also really trying to put Singapore on the map as a rule of law hub. And so in some ways, I found I was pushing on an open door when I spoke with people like Sundaresh Menon, then Attorney General, now Chief Justice, the Minister for Law, the Ministers for Education and Finance, when I said, look, if we want Singapore to be a rule of law hub, then yes, you need great laws and institutions, and you need to attract international law firms and so on, but you also need ideas. And we also had a wonderful permanent secretary of law, Pei Swan Jin. He's now the head of Singapore's Economic Development Board. So there was really it was a wonderful moment where I think there was a real willingness to invest in legal research. And so we got resources, we could set up research centers. And so it was a really exciting time. And I thought, well, I could try and be part of this. I could try and be a catalyst and a leader. And apart from anything else, it was just fun to see yourself as part of this sort of building not only of the institution of the law school, but the role that the law school could play within the country's trajectory also.
So did you look at other schools, any school in particular, and say, well, I want my school to be just like that school, in charting the way forward?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, because the time I became dean, 2012, that was around the time. So rankings had been around in the United States for a lot longer, the US News and World Report, but the global rankings of law schools, global rankings of universities had only been around for 6 or 7 years, I think, at that point. And as I reflected on it with my kind of leadership team and spoke with people within the faculty, we realized that it was kind of crazy that the rankings seem to suggest that there is a path to greatness, and greatness equals Harvard or Oxford or whoever, and that we all need to aspire to that. And so what we realized is, no, that particularly in a small jurisdiction like Singapore, where for a long time National University of Singapore, NUS, was the only law school, we shouldn't be aspiring to just being a kind of Oxford College in the tropics or an Ivy League in the tropics, as occasionally some people would suggest. We needed to carve our own path. That said, there are certainly lessons that we could learn from other institutions. And I suppose the two key things that I took away from having worked particularly at New York University and at Oxford, and studied at Oxford, were globalization and the role of centers. So globalization, you have to be connected to the world. You have to expose yourself to global criticism, be open to global ideas coming in, and to attract the greatest faculty and students from around the world, even if they're only coming as visitors. And so we had a big push in terms of the student experience, sending our students abroad, but also bringing foreign students in, expanding the master's program to bring in more students, but also aggressively recruiting faculty and sending our own faculty out. So that was one part, globalization. And that really, we benefited a lot from NYU's global law school approach. And then the second thing was the importance of centers, that you have individuals doing great work, but not always being great at showcasing it. I would have colleagues who would produce a fantastic book, and then I'd say, let's organize a book launch. They would say, oh, no, 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 no. If people want to read the book, they can buy the book, but I don't need to go out and sell it. And really, as dean, I saw part of my job as being to showcase work. And one way to do that in areas of excellence is a research center where you can gather together both the local expertise, but also help use it as a kind of a center of gravity to attract the expertise within the country, but also from abroad, but also as a platform to project that out to the world. And so one of the things we did with the resources that I mentioned that the government was willing to supply, and then we got some philanthropic support also, we picked some fairly obvious areas for Singapore, like law and business, banking and finance law, maritime law, but also Asian legal studies. It was kind of shocking to me that the main centers of research in Asian legal studies back around 2012 were places like the United States or Australia. Nothing against these great research centers, but it was strange that there weren't more of these centers in Asia. And what I discovered is that a lot of the research that was going on, the so-called comparative research, tended to be colonially focused. So Singapore would look at its relationship with England, Vietnam with France, Indonesia with the Netherlands. And there was not a lot of cross-Asian or intra-Asian comparisons. And so one of the things we did with some key colleagues like Gary Bell, like Jacqueline Nyo, Kevin Tan, and others, was really try to shift the focus of Asian legal studies to Singapore, to Asia in general, and to Singapore in particular. And so in that way, that I think was a little bit different from some of the approaches in other universities, except to the extent that we were really leaning into our own expertise. And then maybe the last sort of soft thing, if those were two kind of more strategic things, the most important thing in terms of any kind of leadership role is the people you work with, and try to help them be motivated, help them have the resources they need, help give them direction. So happily, all of this came together, obviously not without hiccups, but I'm pretty pleased with where we all ended up.
Talk about those hiccups. What would you say was the biggest one?
Well, I mean, the biggest challenge in any kind of management is people. And I think one thing I learned early on, and maybe this is a bit of advice I would give myself, the same advice that a friend gave me when I first became dean. She was a significant person within McKinsey, and so she gave me 6 volumes extracted from the Harvard Business Review to read about management. And the 2 things I took away from that were, one, the difference between management and leadership, and secondly was the different leadership styles. And so the first thing, the difference between management and leadership, I think really is something that anyone who comes into a leadership role needs to understand, especially perhaps an academic one. Because management is the ability just to keep the wheels turning, to keep the lights on, the electricity, air conditioning going, people getting paid. If that all falls apart, then everything stops. But if that's all that you do, then you haven't really achieved anything. And that's where leadership comes in. That leadership is trying to provide direction, trying to provide the foundations of a strategy, meaning, okay, you work out where you are, where you want to go, how you're going to get there. And so I think one of the challenges, one of the hiccups, was that discussion about strategy, about direction, because early on in my tenure, we had a curriculum review, and a small group of us developed a consultation paper and circulated it. Just some ideas we were floating, including crazy things like switching the degree to being a graduate degree, all sorts of just pie-in-the-sky ideas, one of those sort of brainstorming, no wrong idea scenarios. And a number of colleagues reacted with outrage. And it took me some time to work out that basically what they thought was that consultation like this in Singapore sometimes meant it's all happening and you're not being consulted, you're being sensitized. And so there was some teething issues there, I suppose. So that was one issue. And then the second is leadership style, trying to work out what your own leadership style is. And there are different metaphors, the sort of the coach, the example, the disciplinarian, the teacher. and trying to work out what motivates people and what will help them do what they need to do. And one thing I discovered there was that I needed to be extremely careful in the message that I gave people. So my first annual review, we have a very elaborate annual review process at NUS, which involves sitting down with each faculty member to talk about what they've done in terms of teaching, research, and contributions to administration and so on. And I used that opportunity to try and, what I thought was, give a couple of people a pat on the back, some others a bit of a nudge, and a very small number a bit of a talking to. And then, because it was my first time doing this, I actually met with everyone 6 months later just to find out sort of how things were going. And what I learned was that often there's a big difference between what one says and what is heard. And in particular, a couple of people that I'd thought I'd merely sort of given a nudge saying, yeah, okay, just maybe try this. They interpreted it as a slap across the face. And some of the people where I thought I was trying to put a firecracker under them or to sort of give them a bit of a talking to, they thought everything was just fine. And so, yeah, that was another thing that I learned, which was what I said was often less important than what was heard and how it was interpreted by the person.
How then did you make that 360 so that not only are you sensitive to what you say, but how it's perceived without prolonging every conversation interminably?
Yeah, so what I started doing was exactly a 360 review. I started a process of anonymous feedback on the dean, which we did every year subsequently. And my senior administrator, when it was time to do that, when it was time to administer the survey again, she would take me aside and say, are you sure you really want to put yourself through this again? Because giving faculty the opportunity to anonymously complain about the dean was hurtful sometimes, to read the kind of things that people were writing, but reassuring also in that it was a tiny minority. And as you know, sort of lawyers are very good at dressing up self-interest as objective truth and arguing for a living. And so I would then provide this feedback. I would share at least the quantitative data with the faculty, which would show, yes, I mean, some people were very unhappy. For example, the sort of globalization push that I mentioned. Some people thought, no, we should just focus on narrowly Singapore interests and ignore the rest of the world. I think that's a mistake, but there were some conservative people like that, and others who thought that the whole research center thing was a waste of time because it was just sort of investing in show ponies, and we were attracting these stars, but that was bad because it made some of the local people look bad. I thought that's also crazy because you should be aspiring to compete with the very best. So in one sense, it was educational to find out what people thought, reassuring that most faculty were happy with the direction in which we were going, but also sobering to realize, well, you can't necessarily expect everyone to like everything you're doing all of the time.
Let me ask you two things that you might have experienced as a leader coming in. One is you were fairly young when you became dean. I'm not sure if you were the youngest dean ever at the law school, but certainly one of the younger deans. I think you were in your 30s. And the other was that you were coming in as an outsider. And many of the deans at that point had been, if you like, coming through the ranks, Tommy Coe and so on. How did that shape your experience as a dean?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tommy was actually younger when he was appointed. I think he might have been in his early 30s. I was in my late 30s. But yes, I was the first non-Singaporean dean since colonial times, basically. And that was one of the more interesting questions in the dean search process, was whether Singapore was ready for a non-Singaporean dean. And we'd had Malaysian deans, I think, naturalized, I think formerly Malaysian, now Singapore citizen deans. I am married to a Singaporean. I have Singaporean extended family. So I don't think I was seen as an outsider, like someone who just parachuted in. But it was an issue. And in the sort of dean search process, I think two things kind of helped me. One was my family and I are committed to Singapore. Clearly, I'm still in Singapore. I'm a permanent resident and so on. We've got Singaporean children. But also the case I made was that the law school in particular needed to be global. More than half sorry, I think Singapore's trade is 3.5 or 4 times GDP. So there's a huge amount of cross-border activity that goes on. A lot of the legal work in Singapore, even if it's sort of domestically focused, has an international dimension. So the idea that you could just be purely local, I think would be a mistake. So those two things, the sort of my investment in Singapore and the need to have a global perspective, I think were helpful. But I would like to think it was also that I brought ideas and this sort of vision for a law school that was part of positioning Singapore, not just as a rule of law hub, but as a real thought leader in legal research, teaching. I would hope that that was also persuasive.
So it sounds like age was less of an issue, what's more the international part of it.
Yeah, so age, in some ways, it helped that I'd been going grey a little bit earlier. It was more of an issue for one of my vice deans who had been a student in the faculty. And what she found extremely challenging was being in a position where she was also in her late 30s, early 40s. But we have a number of faculty members in their 60s who had taught her as a student. And she found that intensely awkward, both because of the age difference and in some cases the gender difference. And so she and I had some really interesting conversations about how she could carry out her function and explain to the former teachers where, as an individual, she should culturally be deferential to them, but that her office needed to tell them what to do, when to teach, to comply with policies and so on. So that was a bit of a challenge. And so in that sense, maybe my being an outsider helped a little bit. And occasionally I do think Australians get a bit of a pass. I know you mentioned that I was involved in crisis group. Gareth Evans, former Australian foreign minister, the former head of crisis group. I've noticed sometimes when he's saying something a little bit controversial, he'll lapse into more of an Australian accent. And so I think that some people interpret that as meaning, well, he's Australian, he doesn't understand what he's doing, is a little bit culturally inappropriate. And so I think sometimes the older faculty would forgive my youthful exuberance and impertinence as being out of ignorance rather than out of malice.
That's really interesting. So talk about mentors. Do you think about a particular person when you think about leadership? And I want to be like this person in how I approach issues of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I've benefited from a lot of advice, seeing good leaders, having support. I mean, I think the starting point for a lot of us is having a sort of stable family life, being able to share experiences with siblings and so on. One of my brothers also studied law, and he and I would have long chats. Probably the two people who had the biggest impact would be my doctoral supervisor, Ian Brownlee, and David Malone, my first boss. And then I'd add Benedict Kingsbury. So just talk briefly about them. So Ian Brownlee, who passed away in a car crash back in 2009, I think, in Egypt. My doctoral supervisor was a kind of international lawyer's lawyer, but also a through and through Yorkshireman. So in 3 years of doctoral supervision, he never said anything nice to me, which actually was good for me. I think I needed to have my sort of ego pulled in a little bit. I needed to do the work. And then when the thesis was ready for submission, I remember he said the nicest thing he'd ever said to me. He said, "Well, Mr. Chesterman, you appear to have cut the mustard." And what I learned from that was not that you have to be a mean person as a supervisor, but that the role of the supervisor is to forge the kind of relationship that will be good for the doctoral student. And so some doctoral students really need a lot of support, some need a little bit of tough love. And so to think of it in those terms. After I was no longer his student, we became good friends and he was very supportive and very helpful. So that was one thing, the doctoral relationship. Second, David Malone, my boss at the International Peace Academy, what's now the International Peace Institute. He was a distinguished Canadian diplomat, High Commissioner to India, among other roles. He represented Canada on the Security Council. And one great thing he did for me was he would promote junior people. So he was a distinguished person in his own right. And sometimes in the think tank world, it's all about the leader. And so people will do the work, and then either their work goes out under the organization's name or under the leader's name. And David was not like that at all. He really encouraged us to publish under our own names, and not just to publish the kind of think tank policy reports that we all had to do, but to do academic work as well, because that was how he sort of found joy also. So he was a distinguished diplomat, but he was also an author. And so the thing I learned from that is that you can really promote your juniors, and that does not diminish you as a leader. It actually helps the organization, helps everyone, motivates people much more. And so that was another important lesson. And that went as far as him telling me to leave the organization, which is not something that many leaders will do. But he had a vision of a think tank as a place where people would come in, do good work, and then go on to the next big thing. And that was great advice for me, and it's good advice in many situations that people should grow through an organization. And then Benedict Kingsbury at New York University was just an amazing scholar. His rigor, his willingness to reinvent himself, to learn new things. So he'd had a distinguished career. He was regarded highly in academia. And then together with Dick Stewart, he had this whole pivot to start global administrative law. That's about 20 years ago now. And more recently, now he's looking at space and so on. So that really inspired me and had a direct impact on my own intellectual trajectory, that you don't have to just rehash your doctoral thesis over and over again. Because when I was working at NYU, I'd done my doctoral thesis on humanitarian intervention, and there were endless opportunities to talk about humanitarian intervention. But I realized that if that's all I did for my career, it'd be pretty boring. And so that was one of the reasons why I started pivoting initially to post-conflict administration, but then increasingly looking at the role of technology, both in international affairs and diplomacy, and then the rise of personal data and data protection, and then more recently AI. Yeah, so those would be some of the key people who had an impact.
So international humanitarian intervention, how did you get into that?
So like most doctoral students, I arrived with an idea and then had it dashed by my supervisor. So back in 1997, I arrived in Oxford University with a plan to do a doctorate on theories of international criminal law, which I'd actually written on in a sort of honors thesis. And my first meeting with Ian Brownlee, he sat down and said, so what's your topic? And I explained it. He said, no, I'm not going to supervise that. And initially I thought, oh my goodness, having got the scholarship, got the position, I was going to have to go home. But he sent me off to the library and said, come back in a month with 3 or 4 new topics. And actually that was also very liberating to realize that the doctorate should not just be a kind of extension of what I'd done before, it should be something new. And so I looked at a bunch of topics, including space law and other things, and then realized that humanitarian intervention was a kind of interesting topic. It was a good limit case for international law. And as it turned out, it happened to coincide with the Kosovo intervention, which happened about 2 years into my thesis, which made it much more current.
But why international law? What was it about international criminal law that...
So international law. So I mentioned earlier, I went up to study in China before going to law school, before going to university. And so in addition to learning a bit about multiculturalism and about Australia, it also meant that when I was studying law from day one, I was always interested in the comparative dimension, how different countries do this. Because one narrow thing that lawyers sometimes do is they assume that their jurisdiction is the only one that matters and the only way to do things. And having lived in another country, that was pretty clearly not the case. And it complemented so when I was doing undergraduate law in Australia, it's paired with another degree. So I was doing arts with majors in political science and Chinese. So I did a lot of international relations also. So I suppose I was interested in law. And the reason I got interested in law in the first place was understanding power, understanding how power is regulated. And one of the sort of theoretical approaches that attracted me was critical legal studies and the sort of power dynamics within a jurisdiction. And international law is just, the power dynamics are much more obvious. because international law constantly has to fight for its legitimacy. I mean, the history of international law, people like this guy, the history of international law is the aspiration for international law to be more than one foreign policy justification among others, which is often how it works. There's well, we need to do this because A, B, C, O, and international law as well. And so I was always interested in international law precisely because it's so weak, precisely because it's so primitive, as is sometimes said, because that makes the kind of the workings of it, the challenges of it more obvious and really interesting just in terms of academic analysis.
Can I ask you something? Because I think you raised a point which leadership also has a role in. International law, whether in the broad sense or whether in specific areas like IP, has been criticized as being Western-driven. And so when you talk about a reform of international law, the idea behind it is that you have to bring in more cultural elements, history, geography of other civilizations matter. Is that something which is realistic, given that a country that you have been part of, the country that I'm in right now, the United States, is very much insular in the way that it approaches the law? The Supreme Court does not cite any other jurisdiction. We hardly talk about in our law schools anything except US law. We don't really look outside, and that perhaps explains why you have comments about people eating dogs and cats in Ohio as being believable rather than laughable. Where does leadership come in?
Yeah, which is on the phenomenon. I mean, Anthea Roberts has a great book about whether international law is really international. We often ask, is international law really law? But she asks, is international law international? And she did a great study of, among other things, how it's taught in the United States, where often it's not really international law, it's foreign relations law. And that's part of American history, the tension between the sort of idealistic, the manifest destiny and the leadership, and the isolationism that has that's been a theme through US history. And I think Trump really features in that sort of tradition by sort of saying we've got to look inwards. Plus, America is just a big enough jurisdiction that you can, in a way that Singapore could never. I think it was Andrew Christie, actually, in the IP space, did a study looking at how often courts cite outside jurisdictions, and Singapore, I think, was up the top. Australia was reasonably high, and then England was much narrower, partly because the size of the jurisdiction. So what does this mean for leadership? Well, I think leadership, one challenge in any multicultural jurisdiction is how you navigate between potential cultural divides. I think this was something that Benedict Kingsbury actually taught me, which is that we often think about community in the sense of like who's in it, but actually community is often defined by who's out of it. And we see that kind of tribalism in the United States now politically. But what that means for leadership is you need to try and have overlapping communities. I mean, to bring it home to Singapore, the Faculty of Law here has the population split, if you like, is about 50% foreigners, about 25% permanent residents like me, and 25% or so foreigners on sort of long-term visit and employment passes and so on. And it would be very bad if there was a divide between those groups that were seen as antagonistic, or if there was a kind of generational divide. Although these fissures can emerge, hopefully part of the role of leadership is to try and avoid them becoming fractures. And so here, actually, my work on post-conflict reconstruction became sort of helpful, because one of the things you learn in post-conflict reconstruction is you need to manage incentives, but you also need to manage spoilers. So managing incentives is you need everyone to buy into a peaceful process when actually the financial interests, to put it most base in its most base terms, the financial interests of some are best satisfied through conflict. I mean, war, a lot of money can be made in war, including civil war. So you need to sort of establish those incentives to try and ensure that everyone's best interest is aligned in some sort of shared common vision. One great piece of advice I got, I think it was from one of those Harvard Business Review books, is it's always a good policy to go into every meeting assuming everyone feels underappreciated or undervalued. So that's one thing, to try and get people to buy in. Spoilers is also an important point, and not to make this too extreme, but in some conflicts, you need to work out, okay, who can you include? But if there are some people who really are irredeemable, then you just need to marginalize them, exclude them. And in any faculty, there are people who are more and less helpful. You try and win over as many as you can. But the ones who you really cannot win over, you try and engage in harm minimization strategies. And so through all of this, yeah, you try and build that community, hopefully that can work and grow together.
So you are at NUS College. It's in a sense a new beginning, but in a sense also uncharted waters, because you are the founding dean, and NUS College is not quite Yale NUS College. It's designed to be something different. What are your KPIs, and how would you know that you've succeeded?
Yeah, so NUS College is best understood as a kind of US honors college. So every year, National University of Singapore brings in around 7,000 undergraduates. We pick 400 or 500 of them to give a bespoke, more personalized program. They do their compulsory university-wide modules in much smaller classes. They have access to special programs as a residential program. And perhaps most interestingly, we have a 2-year compulsory, what's called an impact experience project, where the idea is you take students from different disciplines and bring them together as a team to work on a real world problem over 2 years. And that's driven by the reality that the world's problems don't fall neatly into academic disciplines. So you need lawyers working with engineers, scientists, philosophers, computer scientists, and so on. It does build on Yale NUS and the University Scholars Program, which was a prior NUS program. But it is different. It's not trying to run an entire liberal arts college the way Yale NUS was, which was a fantastic program. It's got 1 more year to run, but unbelievably expensive in Singapore's terms. So we were tasked basically with offering elements of that kind of liberal arts tradition, but on a more sustainable and accessible basis. So we have many, many more students. We can do it much more efficiently because we're part of the whole NUS ecosystem. And so my job coming in was partly to take on the challenge of the personnel we were bringing in from Yale NUS and the University Scholars Program, but not having a dog in either of those fights, to try and get people focused on sort of where we would go together in the future rather than looking back into the past. And I always tell our students I have one KPI, one key performance indicator, which is them. The quality of the students we can attract and the quality of the experience we can give them, and then eventually the quality of whatever careers they go on to. And one thing that my colleagues and I were very clear about was we didn't just want to attract the quote unquote brightest students. We wanted to attract the students who would benefit from and contribute to this interdisciplinary residential community and really regard their education as an opportunity to serve the community rather than just to accrue credentials. So we're in our 3rd academic year now. So we grandfathered in some students, so we've had graduations, but it will be some years before you see the fruits of this. And that's one of the challenges in academia, that I mean, your research, you can publish your research and there's a bang or there's a whimper maybe, but on academic programs, the educational mission of university it's like a super tanker, in that it's slow turning. It takes a long time to get anywhere and a long time to see the impact. But at the same time, I think in terms of job satisfaction, sometimes the administration's getting you down, you're having budget fights, sometimes your research isn't working out the way you want it to. But I always take solace in the fact that we have these amazing students who are coming in, benefiting from this experience, and then hopefully going on to do great things for which my colleagues and I might try and take just a tiny bit of credit.
Is your program ranked the way that a Faculty of Law's program is ranked?
No, so this is actually one of the interesting challenges. And in fact, we've got a retreat next month where we're going to really focus on some team building, but also what does success look like for NUS College? Because there are honors colleges in the United States and elsewhere, but they're not exactly like us. There's not really a ranking that would be relevant to us. And so the kinds of measures that we're looking at are much more kind of To what extent can we attract students to NUS to join NUS College that would not otherwise maybe come to NUS? And then where do they go afterwards? And the problem with the latter measure is that the easiest thing to measure is salary. But I think one thing I've learned over the years in academia is that those kind of incentives don't necessarily match anything like success in life or impact on the community. And so if we really just want to maximize that, we should just focus on recruiting lawyers and investment bankers and maybe computer scientists. But we want a broader range of people. And so happily the university is invested in this and is willing to work with us. They want to make sure we're doing something measurable, something that we can determine whether we're improving, whether we're doing our job well. But it's not going to be the narrow ranking like the law school, or hopefully not just the question of are our graduates earning more than the average.
Is your vice provost portfolio tied to what you're doing at NUS College, or is that separate from it?
So it's overlapping. So I mentioned that NUS College brings students from around the university. All of our students are doing a degree in another faculty. So we're a faculty, but we do about 1/3 of their curriculum, 2/3 they do in their disciplinary faculty. And so it helps to have a provost office role to when I'm communicating with the other deans and so on. But the other thing I'm doing within the provost office is leading a project looking at AI and the future of education. And that's relevant partly to my NUS College role. About a quarter of our students are doing computer science. All of our students have sort of the basics of AI as a digital literacy module. But one thing I'm looking at is we have a lot of people working on AI right now. So how to do, like what to do with plagiarism policies on generative AI, introducing AI into the curriculum. A lot of people working on that, blended classrooms and so on, blended learning. But one thing I'm looking at is a project saying, okay, well, 10 years from now, what might the role of a university be? And that requires you to think through, okay, what are the changes to the economy, to the labor market, to our approach to knowledge, and in particular, the role of knowledge workers? What will be the role in terms of research? And so that's a much more forward-looking thing. But the connection with NUS College is that I'm pretty sure we're not going to get to a future where we say what we need is less classroom time, less human interaction. And so one thing we can cultivate within NUS College is that human interaction, complemented by appropriate use of technology. But the provost office role gives me both the opportunity to use NUS College as a kind of laboratory to try things, which we can then, if appropriate, percolate through the rest of the university, but also gives me that kind of 20,000-foot perspective across the university to see what's happening within NUS, and also a platform to go out to other institutions, compare notes, and sort of compare strategies about how we can best prepare our students and ourselves for a world that I think is going to be transformed.
Thanks. Two final questions as we wrap up. One is you're a prodigious writer, and you write across a staggering variety of genres, from fiction to nonfiction, and as I understand it, even plays. So walk us through your writing process, and is it different from one genre to another?
Well, the thing I discovered as a fiction author is that unlike law, you can just make stuff up. It's great. You don't need to worry about footnotes and so on. But no, I do think they're different. They're clearly different voices, but that's something I've always wanted to cultivate, because I think I was never the kind of academic who just wanted to live up in the ivory tower, produce my impenetrable works, and stay up there and then have a few disciples or whatever. So I've always experimented with different voices, including mass media. So I think it's actually a great discipline. I know you've done this as well, to write for a mass market, to try and make something important understandable to a newspaper reader. But yeah, the bottom line is it all takes time and energy. And one thing I've learned about myself is that in some ways, managing your energy is more important than managing your time. And what I mean by that is, as dean, I mean, I'm very busy. I have a hectic calendar. And sometimes I would find it very hard when a colleague who has no administrative role would say, oh, I can only write when I have weeks clear in my calendar. And I say, look, that would be impossible for me. If I have 2 hours clear on my calendar, that's fantastic. In fact, I'll be doing that later today. And so what the point I'm making is that you just having time is not enough. You need to manage your energy. And so to work out when you're going to be most productive. And so what that means is that I'll try and carve out time, in particular in mornings, to write, and then push all of the kind of email and other stuff to the afternoon or to the evening when you don't need as much intellectual energy. And this actually reminds me of great advice on writing from Joseph Weiler, who runs a sort of seminar on how to write a doctorate. And he will have this sort of build up saying, I'm going to tell you how much time you need to work on your doctorate to get it done on time, on schedule. And he'll sort of build up this sort of moment of silence. And it's 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. And people would think that's crazy. But then he explains, no, but that's 5 real hours, like real focus, no distractions, no email, no sort of going for a coffee, just 5 intense hours. And I think that's right, that if you can really focus, you don't need huge amounts of time. And I think that's helped with my writing.
Thanks. Last question. Every leader needs downtime. I imagine that even with your polymath skills, that's true for you. What does taking care of your mental wellness look like?
Yeah, very, very important. So time with family and running, basically. So trying to have dinner with my wife and kids as much as possible. So we really try to prioritize that. Only be out maybe a couple of nights a week at most, and otherwise to have meals together. And then running. So jogging is my meditation. So I know if I don't go for a jog, I'll after a couple of days, I'll start to have nervous energy. And I think that
How far do you run?
only about 5 kilometers. So I mean, I've never been one of those people who was attracted by a marathon. I mean, the idea that you would run a race that commemorates the fact that someone ran that distance and dropped dead never really attracted me. But no, 5 or 6 kilometers.
And you do it indoors or at the gym?
So I'm one of the
I mean,
crazy
outdoors.
here, one of the crazy people in Singapore who runs outside and gets drenched in sweat.
Yeah.
But during the pandemic, that became more common. I actually I find it strange now to run in a cold environment when you're not sweating. But sometimes on treadmills as well, listening to podcasts. But I find after a kilometer or two, whatever's stressing me, whatever's worrying me, sort of gets pushed out by the effort of running. And then in the aftermath, sometimes fresh ideas come, and hopefully, as strange as this might sound to someone who doesn't run, more energy comes after you've sort of recovered. But I think everyone needs to work out their own self-care method.
Thank you. Words of wisdom. And with that, we'll wrap up our conversation. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Profiles in Leadership.